I've analysed several TED speeches here on this YouTube channel, but today is the first one with a TED speaker that I've personally worked with. Today we're going to be looking at the TED Talk of one of my former clients, Ije McDougall. I first met Ije right at the beginning of COVID. Ije at the time was running a charity that helped orphan children in her home country of Nigeria. And what she was looking to do was she was looking to find new ways where she could raise awareness of her charity, to fundraise, to get her and her work out there a little bit more. And that's when we started working together, looking at, in particular, virtual speaking skills, because we're all having to speak on camera at that point. We're working together for a couple months, and then we get to June 2020. George Floyd is murdered. There is a huge awareness and zeitgeist around Black Lives Matter, about diversity, anti-racism, and Ije, as a black woman living in the predominantly white country here in the UK, wants to add her voice to it, add her perspective to all of the different issues and topics that are being raised around this time. So she comes to me with this speech. And you're going to see the evolution of that speech in this TED Talk today. She delivers a speech that Black Lives Matter is an idea whose time has come. She does it as a Facebook Live, and the Facebook Live goes viral. It gets shared all over the place, people are seeing it, and Ije starts to get speaking opportunities off the back of this one Facebook Live, this one talk, and over the past 5 years, she has been absolutely rocking it, speaking to tons of companies and organizations here in the UK and further abroad, all around these topics of diversity, equality, inclusion. And I knew she was destined for the TED stage. And I'm so pleased that her time in the red circle has finally come. And it's a huge little proud coach moment to see her stepping into that big red circle. And also, it's a proud coach moment to get to analyze and look at this speech, look at what she's been doing so well all over these years, and have a little bit of a behind the scenes look at this story that she tells on stage. So I'm not going to spoil it anymore. Just a quick disclaimer before we start. First of all, this is an analysis of the TED speech. If you want to see the actual speech in its entirety, just click the link in the description below. I've put a link to the full speech, so if you haven't watched the full speech already, go and watch it. The footage of that full speech is provided, of course, by TED. I do not claim ownership of this footage. The use of this footage is for informational and educational purposes only. Now let's look at this speech by Ije McDougall. Before you look away, look again.
I want to tell you.
At the beginning, Ije comes onto stage, holds that space, takes a look around the audience, makes some smiles, and starts to build that connection before her first word. This is how you start with composure. Don't rush onto stage and try and speak over everyone's applause. Take that moment, center yourself in stage, and build that connection with the audience. It's a sign of a confident, experienced speaker, and Ije is certainly that.
I want to tell you the full story. But first, when I say the word Medusa,
I want to tell you the full story. This is preparing the audience. This is a prompt for us as the audience. But first, then creates this unanswered question. Well, what is the full story? When are we going to hear it? What's the story going to be about? And this generates curiosity in us as the audience. As a speaker, the most important principle behind your start is sparking that curiosity. Now, there's lots of different approaches and lots of different techniques for how you do this, but that underlying principle is the audience have to be curious about what's going to happen next, what you're going to say, where is this going? And Ije uses this technique of creating this unanswered question, of hinting to this full story, but not yet launching into this. It builds the suspense, it builds the tension. Now, at some point, of course, you then have to answer the question, because if you don't answer the question, then the audience are getting confused, lost, distracted, they're starting to get into their heads. So it's this balancing act between creating that curiosity, but also paying off that curiosity. So here we see Ije is sparking that curiosity. Is she going to pay off that curiosity later in the speech?
I'm a Nigerian. This is how we tell stories. I say, story, story, and you say, story. Then I say, once upon a time, and you say, time, time. Shall we try? Story, story. Story. Once upon a time. Excellent. There lived.
Here we see a blending of a couple of different techniques. First of all, we've got some audience interaction. Ije is less than a minute into her speech and she's already asking the audience to interact. This is a bold move. Sometimes audiences can be a bit passive. Sometimes they don't want to interact. So you've got to be careful of how quickly you make them start to interact and be vocal. But what you can see here that Ije has clearly managed to do that. So you can sometimes get a vibe when you're at an event of how engaged or talkative an audience might be. And also, even if they aren't, it's your job to get them engaged as a speaker as well. So it's bold to ask for that interaction early on in the speech, but Ije's managed to pull it off. For me, great speaking is always about taking a bit of a risk. It's always about being bold. It's always doing something that might not work, that might cause you to have a bit of egg on your face, but when you pull it off, it makes it all that sweeter. So this is the first aspect that's coming in. The second aspect here is we're seeing a little bit of Ije's cultural identity coming through here. She's adding in that sprinkle of, well, what makes her different and unique as a speaker? And one of that aspect is bringing in that Nigerian culture, bringing in that storytelling ethos of being Nigerian. So we're seeing a couple different things here. Ije is building that interaction and engagement with the audience, but she's also thinking about how she's positioning herself as a speaker. And ultimately, why should the audience listen? Because that's always the question in the back of the audience's mind that you've got to answer. And so you've got to show not what makes me the same as everyone else, what makes me different to everyone else. And this is one of the things that Ije's bringing in here to make her storytelling look, feel, and sound different. Because loads of people come up on stage and tell stories, but what makes Ije's storytelling special? That's what she's bringing in, and that's what she's building up as she starts to launch into what is ultimately the signature story, not just of this TED Talk, but the signature story of so much of the work that Ije has done. And it's actually this signature story that we worked on together all of those years ago when I was coaching her.
There lived a young lady called Medusa. She's described as being very beautiful. They would talk about her gorgeous hair.
Here we start to hear the story of Medusa. This is the story that Ije brought to me all of those years ago, and ultimately what I gave her some suggestions on and what she's gone on to craft and evolve herself over the years. Here's why the Medusa story works. The Medusa story is, and certainly in the way that Ije tells it, the blending of the familiar and the unfamiliar. We have a story of Medusa that most people will know a bit about. We go, oh yeah, Medusa, she's the snakes and the freezing people to stone. So people know enough about it to be familiar with it. When you say, does anyone know Medusa? And they're like, no, sorry. All right, okay. So there's this cave, and there's this woman, and there's this hero, and he's got a shield with a mirror, and he uses the shield with a mirror to see her. So when you have to tell people who Medusa is, it takes the momentum out of the story. So it's familiar enough that people know, oh yeah, Medusa, snake hair, freezing stone, blah, blah, blah. but it's also unfamiliar enough that people don't know this other aspect of the story, this aspect of the story that EJ goes on to share. So when you're telling a story, or in fact, when you're just delivering a speech in general, you'll think about this blending of the familiar and unfamiliar. If everything's too familiar, people nod, yeah, whatever. So an example of a story that's too familiar is my obsession with Star Wars, for example. If you haven't watched Star Wars, you still know that Darth Vader is Luke Skywalker's dad. Just because everyone knows that. So if you tell a story and you say, well, did you know there's this guy called Luke Skywalker and he doesn't really realize the bad guy is his dad? Well, no, everyone knows the bad guy is his dad, even if they don't necessarily know the rest of the story. So that's something that's too familiar. You're not going to get anything out of it. But if I instead said, by the way, do you know the Star Wars character Darth Bane? Well, who's Darth Bane? I go, well, Darth Bane's really important because he created the rule of two. Right, okay, well, what's the rule of two? Right, okay, so there's these good guys called the Jedi, there's these bad guys called the Sith, and Darth Bane was a Sith, and what he... So, I'm not going to tell you the whole story of Darth Bane, but Darth Bane is too unfamiliar. Unless you're a die-hard Star Wars fan, you won't know who Darth Bane is. But even if you're not a fan at all, you'll know that Darth Vader is Luke Skywalker's dad. So you've got something that's too familiar, you've got something that's too unfamiliar. What EJ does with Medusa is she finds that sweet spot in the middle. People know enough about Medusa for it to be familiar, but not enough about Medusa to know, as she puts it, the whole story. And this is the foundation that you've got to build your speeches on. If you come up on stage and you share a speech that's too familiar to the audience, they'll go, yeah, right, okay, yeah, whatever, I've heard this all before. They won't take it in. But equally, if you share a speech that's too unfamiliar, the audience will go, right, okay, what happened there? Where were we? It'll go over their heads too much. Find that sweet spot between the familiar and the unfamiliar. And that's where you get the audience on side enough to follow you, but also be surprised and novel enough to be interested in you.
Poseidon. Side note, Poseidon and Athena have beef, but that's a whole other story.
So I like this bit where EJ talks about Poseidon and Athena have beef. When you're telling a story, you've got to be so discriminate about what details you leave in and what details you leave out. Now, I'm sure, I don't know the full story myself, but I'm sure the story of why Athena and Poseidon have beef is really juicy and interesting and probably worthy of a whole speech in itself. But we don't need to hear that story today. It's not relevant for this speech. So what EJ has to do is acknowledge the conflict there. These characters don't like each other, but she doesn't have to go into the details of why they don't like each other. So I love this little line of how she sums it up, and it kind of brings that modern twist on it. Instead of saying, Athena and Poseidon had an ancient rivalry extending through the ages, EJ says the two of them had beef. It's a bit more colloquial, it's casual, it's informal, so it's a nice way of acknowledging the facts, giving the audience just enough detail, but not bogging them down in the details of the story.
When I say the word Medusa, what first comes to your mind? I often get victim, misunderstood, misjudged. Because of the benefit of the full story, your perspective.
Here we see the payoff of the Medusa story. I didn't show a clip of this, but at the start, right at the start, first minute or so, you can go and see it yourself on the full recording. EJ asks, when you think of Medusa, what do you think? And remember I was talking about this familiarity, unfamiliarity. People will say the familiar stuff, yeah, the snakes for hair, she turns people to stone, she's a monster. When EJ finishes the story and she asks, what do you think of Medusa? And these different words start to come out. What you are doing here is you are showing the audience their change. All you do is you ask two questions at the start and the end. How do you feel about Medusa right now, from what you know? And people can give their answers, and they're often these same answers. And at the end of the story, you say, well, now that you've heard the rest of the story, what do you think? And this is really clever persuasion. When you are trying to persuade people of something, you don't tell them to think that thing, feel that thing, do that thing. You show them how they think, feel, do that thing. These questions don't tell the audience, you've changed your mind about Medusa, haven't you? They show the audience, you've changed your mind about Medusa, haven't you? And that is the power of this story, that the power of this story is it demonstrates to the audience that they change their minds, that they change their perspectives. You aren't telling them to change their minds, you aren't telling them to change their perspectives, you're leading them to that conclusion themselves. When you are telling a story, and when you're just trying to persuade your audience in general, you've got to think of how you guide the audience to the change and help them to realize it themselves. You can't tell them the change, and this is a mistake that we see so much in any kind of persuasive argument, whether that be losing weight, whether that be trying to prevent climate change. We see people telling, this is what you need to do to lose weight, this is what you need to do to save the climate, and that doesn't work. It's not persuasive. People don't like to be told what to do. They like to feel that they have made that decision themselves. Because when someone has made that decision themselves, they can take ownership of it. And with that ownership of it, they have the power of that decision in their own hands. And that's where we get the phrase empower from. You're empowering people by making them feel that they've got charge of their own decisions, and all you've done is help guide them through their own process.
Now, I think we need to sack Medusa's publicist, because all we ever hear about is the snake bit and the monster bit. But
here we have this little light-hearted tone from Ije. She talked about sacking Medusa's publicist. We've heard this serious, intense story of this victim of a tragedy, this mistreated woman, this person who gets perceived and treated as a monster. So we've taken the audience into something that's a little bit darker and a little bit challenging. What Ije's wanting to do now is she's wanting to just shift the energy, shift the emotion in her speech, and just that little light-hearted line about Medusa sacking her publicist, it just shifts that tone a little bit. So if you think of the emotions and energy of a speech, I always call it the heartbeat of the speech, and when I'm teaching storytelling, I talk about the heartbeat method. If you think of that heartbeat monitor, that beep, 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 you've got that down and then you've got that up. You've got that down and you've got that up. And when you've taken people down, you've got to be able to take people up again. Not yanking them up, but easing them up. And these little tricks, like these little light-hearted lines and little quips and little jokes, can help just smooth off that downward trend and start to bring it up again.
it was grief. It was resilience. It was survival.
Here we see a rule of three repetition. It was. Grief, resilience, survival. Rule of three, if you've ever watched any of these analysis videos before, you'll know the rule of three. It's one of the golden techniques of speaking, and we've got a little bit of the repetition weaved in there as well. It's the repetition of that phrase, it is, and then we've got these three defining qualities, and this is really helping to build the character of Lisa, who we're listening to in this second story that Ije tells. Rule of three grabs the audience's attention, draws our attention to important information, and helps us to remember it better as well. Rule of three, classic technique.
With her permission, things changed. We offered support. We made sure she could get home on time. We rallied. Now, it didn't make Lisa any softer, but it did make her feel seen. And that made all the difference.
There's a subtle bit here, but I love the inflection that Ije puts on that. It's this soft, warm inflection. She says, you know what, it didn't change everything about Lisa, but that made all the difference. And you can hear that warmth, that empathy, that connection coming through in that change of tone. It's soft and it's subtle. But when it comes to using the power of our voice and using the voice as the full instrument there is, I often think that when people talk about the voice, they talk too much about the extremes. They talk about, you've got to be really loud, or you've got to speak really fast, or you've got to be really deep and commanding. These are caricatures of how we use our voice, and they're actually caricatures of where the power of our voice comes from. The power of our voice is not in playing on the extremes. The power of our voice is that soft and subtle change across the notes. And that little soft inflection of that is a fantastic example of how we use our voice as the instrument it's intended to be, and not the caricatured tool that a lot of people will make it out to be when they're talking about voice.
For me, Medusa's greatest curse was not the snakes on her head or the transformation of her body. It was the fact that she was never really seen again.
We've just heard about Lisa's story, the anecdote of Ije's colleague, and now Ije comes back to Medusa. So she introduced she introduced with the Medusa story. Try saying that with a mouthful of peanut butter. Then she introduced Lisa, the second story, and now she's calling back to the Medusa story, and she's weaving these two stories together. And what I like about this is the juxtaposition of the mythical story and the real story, the vignette, the anecdote. And what you can see here is that although we've got these two different stories, one that's, let's face it, is a fantasy story, and one that's a real story, we see this common truth. This common truth of being misunderstood. Ije uses these two different stories so that each story will hit people in a different way. The first will be the fantasy story, where it's perhaps a little bit sexier and imaginative, but also perhaps people go, yeah, well, that's just a story. That's not real. What can I learn from the story? So then Ije backs it up with the real story, with the anecdote, the actual person. Now that real story will connect with some people, but it's perhaps not as memorable and sexy and stand out as the Greek mythology. So what Ije is using, she's using different stories because they've got different advantages in how they draw people's attention. And they've got different advantages in terms of how people engage with the foundational truth underneath them. Both stories are about people being misunderstood. And Ije wants to make sure that no matter which story the audience resonate with most, they connect with that truth of people being misunderstood. And so she ties those stories back in towards the end of the speech to make sure that that fundamental truth is coming through for the audience and giving them the best chance of taking away that truth from the speech and ultimately doing something in their lives as a result of now knowing that truth.
Because we live in the world of the 30-second video and the viral headline, we've lost our appetite for the full story.
This use of appetite for the full story, I don't know if Ije was thinking about this deliberately and consciously, but I love this idea of equating knowing the full story as a need. Because appetite, to do with food, that's a need. We need to eat. And the subtle point that I think comes across when Ije talks about losing the appetite for knowing the full story is as if we've lost that need. But we should need to know the full story. We should need to know the full story in the same way that we need to eat, because we can't make a proper judgment, we can't make a proper analysis, we can't make a proper connection with someone unless we know that full story. Knowing the full story is as much a social need as hunger is a physical need. That's the message that I think comes across from Ije's word choice there. Now, I don't necessarily know if this was deliberate, but sometimes the best things in our speech can happen accidentally as well. So whether it's deliberate or whether it's accidental, I love this idea of equating losing the appetite for hearing the full story, but recognizing that we should have this need to know the full story. It's this important social need that we have. And at the moment, it seems that we are neglecting that social need.
That difficult colleague becomes the one who is holding up the roof. That quiet person in the corner becomes the one who is touching lives with their poetry. That cold neighbor becomes the trauma survivor who is navigating life carefully.
We have, of course, another rule of three. So all the benefits of the rule of three, of course, exist here. But what I particularly love about this is EJ brings in these three real-world examples. So, okay, we've talked about the theory and the concept behind this truth of letting people have the benefit of the full story, not judging people on first impressions. But let's see, well, what can I actually do with this? How does knowing this play out in my real everyday life? And that's what EJ's got to start to answer by the end of this speech. I talked about the start of the speech, that underlying principle being curiosity. You have to get the audience interested in what's going to happen next. But by the end of the speech, the underlying principle is implementation. The audience have to do something after listening to your speech. You can have the best speech in the world, the most well-crafted and well-written, the most energetically delivered, but if the audience don't do anything, they might as well not have listened to it. But if you can get your audience to do something different as a result of hearing you speak, that is the one and only marker of impact. If your audience do something different, make a change for the better because they heard you speak, that's impact. And that is what the whole end of your speech is gearing towards, is getting them to implement, getting them to do something. And so what EJ is doing here is she's getting them to think, well, what does that look like for you? She's using these real world examples of, well, if you give people the benefit of the full story, this is what you're going to start to see, to discover, to bring into your life that wasn't there before. That's the difference in your life as a result of listening to me speak.
Studies have shown that when people feel truly seen, things shift. They're more productive, they're more engaged, and they're less likely to burn out.
Here we have a little sprinkle of logic towards the end. Here EJ starts to talk about research. She starts to talk about the stats. She starts to talk about the science. Now, as a psychology graduate, as someone who is very much about bringing the science into things that you're talking about, I absolutely love this. But the mistake that a lot of people make with statistics and science and data and logic is they front load their speeches with it. We as humans think we are logical creatures, but we're actually emotional creatures. We don't make decisions based on logic. We make decisions based on emotion, and we use logic to justify the emotional decision that we've made. So in terms of when it comes to what you present to your audience and the order you present to them, you present the emotional argument first and you build the logic on top of that, not the other way around. EJ, we're now 9 minutes into this speech. For 9 minutes, EJ is focused on emotion. She's focused on the story. She's focused on the metaphor. And here we just have that little boop, little kind of cherry on top of logic. And that's the way it should be. You can't have your speech being all emotional, because people who have more of that logic-minded analysis and interpretation, analytical mind will go, right, yeah, okay, right, very good, but how does this actually look in reality? How does this look when we're not talking about Greek mythology? So you've got to have that logic and analysis to provide that foundational substance behind the emotion, but it shouldn't surpass the emotion. So you can't have all logic and you can't have all emotion, but when you're combining emotion and logic, you've got to recognize that actually it's still the lion's share of emotion, and you just use that little bit of logic almost like the glue that brings it all together into that strong, tangible foundation on which your audience can build.
But in this swipe left culture, we forget that people are not...
Swipe left culture. Swipe left is an analogy, and you can use analogies to help to explain wider truths. So when we're talking about swipe left, we're talking about the dating apps, this idea of making these snap judgments. So instead of EJ saying, today, because of digital technology and all the different apps that we use, we have this tendency to make snap judgments on people. That's this big, long, convoluted way of saying it, isn't it? But when instead she just says, in today's swipe left culture, swipe left says everything about being in a digital age with apps where you make snap judgments about people. It's a much catchier way of saying it. It's a more visual way of saying it. It's a more memorable way of saying it.
People are not summed up by the 280 characters of a tweet. People are novels with pages full of love, of resilience, of hope.
Again, we see this metaphor. People aren't 280 characters on X. People are novels, pages with depth, love, resilience, hope. Again, another little rule of three, just to add that cherry on top again. So again, love this metaphor of people are novels. Again, we're getting this juxtaposition between, well, this is how you might treat people. If Medusa had a 280 character limit, what would you talk about? You would talk about the snakes, you'd talk about the turning her to stone. You wouldn't get the full story. But we know the Medusa isn't a tweet. Medusa is a novel. And we are all novels. So she's using this metaphor, again, just to underline and hammer home this fundamental truth, the ultimate message of the speech, that you can't judge people on a snapshot. You've got to judge people on the full story. And how do you know the full story? You read every page of that novel. You don't read the cliff notes.
You see, when you seek the full story, you breathe life into people who have turned into stone.
This is fantastic speech writing. I would love to claim credit for this line, but I had nothing to do with this line at all. This is all EJ here. Breathe life into people who have turned to stone. First of all, it's a wonderful bit of imagery even in of itself, but that's not the thing that really makes this line. The thing that really makes this line is the thematic tie-in with the Medusa story. Medusa turned people into stone, but we can breathe life into people who've been affected that way. We can breathe life into the people who have been victims of judgment, who haven't had the benefit of the full story. It's a beautiful visual metaphor with that fantastic thematic link in, and that is what great speechcraft is all about, is creating these punchy lines with these evocative images that bind all the themes of your speech together. Beautiful speechcraft from EJ. Someone's taught her well.
In the world of the 30-second headline, will you hold space for the full story? Thank you.
Will you hold space for the full story? She finishes on the tagline. She finishes on the title. She finishes on that foundational phrase, that sticky slogan that gets called so many things, but ultimately the underlying message of the speech is we've got to listen to people's full stories. There's only through knowing the full story that we get the richness of human connection, that we get that understanding and cooperation and collaboration with each other. Who can you give the benefit of the full story to? Who are you going to hold that space for? It's a call to action. It's repeating the fundamental phrase behind her whole speech, sending the audience off. Okay, you've listened to this, you've understood, you felt it, you've resonated. Now what are you going to do with it? Fantastic ending, ending with a bang. What you're seeing in this speech are the fruits of EJ's hard work, dedication, and a little sprinkle of my coaching thrown in there as well. If you're someone who's looking to step onto that big red circle, as EJ has, if you're someone who's looking to speak up on the important issues and topics that face us in the world now, as EJ does, if you're someone who's looking to make an impact with their words, as EJ definitely does, then my coaching can help you to achieve that. If you're interested in finding out what this coaching process looks like, what I did with EJ, and how this coaching can help you for those speaking aspirations, I've popped a link to my LinkedIn in the video description below. Just send me a direct message on there, tell me a little bit about what your speaking challenges are at the moment, what your speaking aspirations are, where you want to go, and we can look at different coaching options and find one that works for you, your goals, your aspirations, and where you want to go. Now, let's look at a little bit of that coaching mindset now. Looking at EJ's speech, all the things that she's done well, if I was to continue to coach her and help her speaking process, what would I be looking at? Let's look at a few things from this TED Talk.
When I say the word Medusa, what first comes to your mind? I often get.
When EJ asked that question, what do you think about Medusa? This is EJ's signature story. She's told this story loads in her speeches. She's asked that question loads, what do you think of Medusa? And she'll get lots of answers to that question. But what she then does is she then automatically starts spoon feeding those answers into this particular audience. Now, although she's delivered this story many times and asked that question many times, this is still a new novel audience. And you want to give that audience the time to think about the question themselves first. So as they sit there, well, what do I think about Medusa? She was a Greek monster. She had snake for hair. She turned people to stone. When EJ then says, often the answers I get are, she's a Greek monster with snakes for hair and turns people to stone, you get this little confirmation affirmation from the audience. They go, oh yeah, that's what I was thinking too, same for me. When you get that confirmation affirmation, you're doing this technique of mind reading. Now, you're not actually mind reading, but you're anticipating what an audience will think, feel, experience, react based upon what you've said. And when an audience goes, oh yeah, that speaker knew what I'd think, they knew what I'd feel, they knew what I'd experience, it creates this link of commonality that, oh, this speaker gets me, they understand me. And that's a really important part of building that trust, rapport, connection between the speaker and the audience. So if EJ allows that pause, allows that space for the audience to think up the answers to that question, you're then going to get that confirmation affirmation come into effect. Whereas by rushing into the answers too quickly, she hasn't given the audience the time to engage with the question themselves first. So if you're using a question to lead into a particular topic or a particular subject, it's absolutely fine to have those answers prepared. Well, here's some of the things that I hear, or here's some of the things that you might be thinking. But give the audience that time and space in between to think for it themselves first. Because they're going to be engaging with the answers that you provide on their terms. You're getting that confirmation and agreement rather than telling them, this is what you've probably thought. You then instead confirm, well, this is what you probably thought, isn't it?
Medusa also had ambition. We like a woman with ambition. She wanted to become a priestess in Athena's temple. Athena, powerful Greek goddess, and Medusa.
I think at this point in the story, we could benefit from a question to get the audience to relate to the story. Because we're starting to dive into this Greek mythology, and some people will love diving into Greek mythology, but some people not so much. So I think here, if we can get the audience to see themselves in the story, a question like, what's an aspirational job that you've had? Or perhaps you've had a person or a leader that you've really wanted to work for. And then the audience will start to see themselves in Medusa's story of, yeah, you know what, like I really wanted this role and I worked hard for it and I went for it, or I really wanted to be mentored by this person and I took the time to reach out and build that connection. Then you're starting to get that affinity and relatability with the character Medusa. So instead of diving into the ancient BCs and these mythological fantasies, we're seeing, well, how does my experience relate to this experience in the story? So just so we don't get our audience too lost in the Greek mythology, and actually, even if this wasn't a mythological story, I would still be given this advice anyway of how can you get the audience to see themselves in this story? And I think just this little question, that little input of helping the audience to see the similarities and generate that familiarity with Medusa would help them to connect and emphasize with this story more.
And in her anger, she punishes Medusa. She turns the beautiful hair into snakes. She makes it such that if Medusa locks eyes with you, you would turn into stone.
Here I would have made more about the eyes, and I would have done this not just at this point in the story, but the start of the story as well. This builds up the tragedy of Medusa and the injustice of Medusa. So when we're introduced to Medusa, she's this beautiful woman with this beautiful hair and beautiful eyes. And I think if we could have some imagery around that, you know, something like eyes like pools of honey, hair like a billowing mane of a horse, something like that. Because when we get to this point, when we get to the punishment of Medusa, Medusa is punished directly in the good aspects of her, directly in some of her virtues. One of her virtues is her beauty, and the punishment hits directly at that her beautiful hair is turned into snakes, that her beautiful eyes, she can no longer look at anyone without turning them to stone. And I think we need to hit at that tragedy and that injustice harder, that Medusa was hit, the best of her was made the worst of her. And I think if we build up this stronger link by talking about her hair and her eyes, because that's the thing that gets turned against her in this tragedy, in this downfall. So we would need to see that at the beginning more by building up the beauty of Medusa more in terms of her hair, in terms of her eyes, and then coming back to the beauty of the hair and the eyes again, that those lovely warm pools of honey are turned into cold, hard stone. Then you build the contrast. Then you see the high and the low of Medusa's story.
She said, "The love of my life is fading before my eyes, and I don't even get to stay home and sulk."
This is a powerful part of the story where we hear Lisa say this line that I don't get to be at home with the love of my life. And up until now, we've heard a lot of Lisa's speech being reported. Ije is saying, she says this, she tells me this, I learned this. We don't hear Lisa's voice throughout a lot of this interaction that Ije has over this lunch with Lisa. This part where we hear Lisa's voice is so powerful. And I would have liked to have heard her voice more in this exchange. So instead of this being a news report of one day I sat down with Lisa and I learned all these things, if we could see this more as a scene, if we could see this as the dialogue between Ije and Lisa. Now, I'm not saying that you have to turn every single line into dialogue and report this conversation blow by blow, but if we could get that blend between having some of this summarizing through the reported speech. So if there's a lot of intense detail and we're not going to hear a ton of back and forth dialogue, let's just sum that up neatly with a little bit of reported speech. But let's expand upon this a lot more, because then we see the interaction between Ije and Lisa. We see a little bit of Ije's character development as well as Lisa's character development. We see Ije being in that place of, hey, maybe I need to open up more, and I need to be less judgmental, and I need to listen to the full story more. Then we have some of that personal vulnerability on the side of Ije of going, look, I'm someone who's made these mistakes before. And you can see that in real time. You can see Ije needing to open up more and hear the full story of Lisa as it plays out in these scenes. And then Lisa is not so much of this kind of faceless character. She's a very active character. We're hearing her more. We're hearing the story told through her voice as much as we're hearing it told through Ije's voice. So I think this was such a great line where we heard Lisa's dialogue. It was powerful, but I think we needed to hear more of it through this scene. So a reworking of this scene so it's less reported dialogue and it's less about EJ telling Lisa's story for us. It's actually EJ taking us into their combined story, and we see the story play out rather than get told the story being told out.
Will you hold space for the full story? Thank you.
I always tell off all of my clients for saying thank you at the end of the speech. Don't end your speech on a thank you. EJ knows this, I've told her this, and she's still done it, so slap on the wrist for EJ. Her final line of, will you make space for the full story, was fantastic. Leave the audience with that line. And to show that you have finished on that line, you have a little bit of a tempo and an energetic build up into the line. The final line of your speech, it should always be obvious that it's the final line of your speech. So EJ builds into that line, she says the tagline of her speech, and when she delivers it, just silence. And if the audience haven't quite got it, and they should get it, you can give this little nod of acknowledgement. Here's why you don't say thank you. Number one, you want that last line to linger with the audience. They will remember the last thing that you said. Don't make the last thing that you said be thank you, and that's remembered, not the important thing that you said before. But secondly, it's not your job at that time to be expressing gratitude to your audience. Your audience should be thanking you. You haven't shown up on that stage. The audience aren't doing you a favor by letting you come up on stage and speak to them. You're doing them the favor by educating them, by training them, by teaching them, by empowering them. And this is not to say that you shouldn't be grateful, that you shouldn't appreciate your audience, but it's just at that point in the speech, that's not when you want to do it. The end of your speech is all about the audience taking something and implementing it. And in that moment, you actually want them to be appreciative of the fantastic gift that you've given them at the end of your speech, the gift that's going to help them put all the things that you've said into play. You don't want it to be a case of they've done you a favor. In that moment, you as a speaker, you have done them a favor. So don't say thank you at the end of your speech because you have this fantastic energetic build up and then poof, thank you. It's this kind of arbitrary, ceremonial, perfunctory thing. Now, of course, there's a great opportunity after your speech, go around to the audience, speak to them, connect with them, say thank you for coming. It's been really great to speak to you today. Thank the event organizer. There is a time for thank yous, just not as the final line of your speech. All my clients get this banged into their skull, and EJ has as well. And clearly, over the years, she's forgotten this little lesson. So just a little reminder to her to let her last line linger, and don't make the last line a thank you line. It's been fantastic watching this speech and getting the opportunity to analyze this speech. This was the type of analysis that I did for EJ throughout our time coaching together of she would send me a speech, I'll look at it and say, here are the things that I really liked, here are the things that need improved. But I always was doing this in a relatively private capacity. She was maybe sending me a recorded video. She would sometimes ask me to look at a Facebook Live, but usually it was private speeches and I was looking at them and I was seeing speeches that the rest of the world weren't seeing. Now I have the opportunity to do the same thing with EJ, but I'm no longer doing it privately. I am looking at her standing on the red circle, speaking on the most public of public stages, speaking at TED, and it's a fantastic privilege, joy to see that journey, have been a part of that journey, and seeing the fruits of the labor that EJ put in for our time when we were coaching together, and so much more afterwards as well. And I think you will have enjoyed watching EJ's speech as well. She's a fantastic woman, doing amazing things, making a key impact, and that's always the end result that I want for everyone that I've worked with. I want to see them going out into the world, sharing great things, making an impact, because that's the ripple effect that we have. When we work with one person, that person goes on and works with many people. And that's what lights me up about coaching speakers. That's what I'm passionate about. And EJ is really the embodiment and the epitome of that passion and of that desire that underlines all of the coaching that I do. I've absolutely loved this. I've absolutely loved watching EJ speak on stage. And I know that she's going to inspire people, and people will point to her and say, I'm doing this because of EJ. And that's when we know we've had our impact as speakers.